all here. I haven't got a treasurer's report for you. Patty finally got a job. You know, she graduated from Gettysburg Seminary, and she's going in as a assistant pastor in Manassas, Virginia. And I've called her a couple of times trying to get the checkbook back up here because we owe Mike Charney some money. He paid the motel bill for our speaker 2 months ago, and I've bought the stamps and the postcards for the last 2 months. So anyhow, hopefully we'll get that up here, and we're going to need another assistant treasurer, so we have 2 people to sign the checks. But anyway, as soon as we get the checkbook back from Patty, why we can proceed with that. I can tell you that last month I made a deposit for $90.50. I don't know who the 50 cents was. I got a suspicion it was Dunkel.
How many always put a quarter in? Wrong. I never carry change. I only carry bills.
Your money only rolling. We're going to get that straightened out.
Working, Bill.
You couldn't hear me. We did get $90.50 in last month, and that was deposited in our account. I'll move right along to our speaker tonight since we are starting a little late. His name is Dave Warner. He's from here in Hershey. I've known him for a number of years. He's one of our top volunteers over at the Hershey Public Library. And I was on the board over there for a number of years, and Dave was a real worker. But I never knew what he did in World War II until I went up to WITF for a premiere showing on the war. And I know I asked for hands once before, and practically everybody watched that series. But if you watch the local productions that WITF did, David is one of them, telling his story. So I ran into him that night, twisted his arm, and got him to come and tell his story here for us. So without further ado, I'll introduce David Warner, Sergeant Battery B, 291st Field Artillery Observation Battalion. And there, David, I'll let you take it.
Thank you, Bill. How's this sound?
Is it button on it?
Broken testing here. You can't hear it in the back?
No. Couldn't hear it when Bill had it either.
It'd be better if you hear me, just my voice. You can't hear my voice better.
We need an audio expert.
Okay. Give it another test here before we go. How about that?
That's
Okay. Field testing, 10, 9, 8, 7. Here. Well, I'll have to give you a good voice tonight. Making sure there's nobody in the back can hear it. It's on. You can hear it. Okay? Not improving the mic? Okay. Well, can you hear my voice just from the, I know it's quite a ways to the back there. I'll try to speak up. Yeah.
You know about him, read about him. But he's all...
Yeah.
Better.
Okay. All right. Probably a lot of you know that 16 million, more or less, men and women got called up in the service during World War II. And I don't think there was probably a town or a hamlet, or for that matter, a street in the United States that wasn't affected by the call-up. But I'm sure that my parents were still somewhat shocked when their 3 sons all got called up within an 8-day period. My older brother went with a contingent from Temple University. Another brother went with a group from Carnegie Tech. And I went with a group from Penn State. We all arrived within an 8-day period down at Fort Meade, Maryland, where I know a lot of you from this area were also inducted down there. And we went through the usual initiation into the Army, you know the routine, your immunization shots, your GI haircut, your your AGCT tests, and all the rest of it. But in any event, an AGCT test is, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's the Army General Classification Test. And basically, it's the Army's equivalent of what they call an IQ test. But in any event, we all had to take that test, and after I had successfully completed it, they shipped me off to Gulfport Field in Mississippi for a basic in the Air Corps. Well, to make a story short, when I got down there, there was further testing, and I didn't qualify for either area gunner or pilot because of what they call peripheral vision. In other words, how far around can you see from the side? It's very important for a pilot or a gunner. But I went through the Air Corps basic anyhow with the expectations of probably ending up being like an aircraft mechanic. But lo and behold, along about September, they pulled a bunch of young men out of all armed services to go to what is termed ASTP, and that was the Army Specialized Training Program. Really what it was really a piece of cake. They sent all of us young fellows back to college. We lived in dormitories, 8 regular meals, 6 regular classes. I don't know what Army official dreamed up this program, but he was really off base because these men were needed in more essential ways than going to college. So ultimately, the program was full. And along about Christmas time, we were sent back supposedly to our original branch of the service. In my particular instance, I thought I was going back to the Air Corps. But lo and behold, I ended up in the field artillery. I asked, why was that? And the man said, well, you're at the end of the alphabet. They filled the artillery, they filled the Air Corps contingent before we got down to your name. So I ended up down at Camp Gordon, Georgia, and started to take a basic training all over again in what is called artillery sound and flash ranging. Now, I didn't know what part of my talk I should inject this business about what sound and flash ranging is, but this is as good a time as any, because that's where it occurred during my Army career. I have a little chart up in here. I'll tell you first that they divided the men up into 2 basic groups. Most of the men went into sound ranging because that required more to operate. A few of the men went into flash ranging. I'll drop this down for a minute. Flash ranging is a very simple operation. There's nothing much to it. Probably any of you that have been in the service, you know that when an artillery gun goes off, there are three things that happen. Number 1, there's a flash. Number 2, there's an explosion, an audible noise. Number 3, and not too many people think about it, there is a pressure wave that goes out from the gun. Okay? Flash uses the flash from the muzzle to locate enemy artillery. Sound uses the pressure wave. Now, here's what happens. Normally, if you have a flash base, you have to send an officer out to reconnoiter the battlefield and determine generally where enemy activity is going on. And he, in turn, will look at his topo maps and determine which points are appropriate for a flash observation post. Now, obviously, these posts are such things like high ground, a church steeple, a water tower, anything that gets you up in the air so that you can see a long distance. My heart and my sympathy always went out to the guys who were selected for OPs, because these guys were really out front. Now let's just say that we have a battlefield situation, and you have an OP here on a church steeple, and he in turn finds a flash going out there someplace. Oh, this is stick. Yes, it will. And he takes a bearing, and he's equipped with binoculars and with either a transit or a theodolite, a very sensitive instrument for determining a map bearing, a compass bearing. And he in turn, perhaps this guy sees a flash over there. And he in turn will communicate down to the command post that he sees this. They will alert the other OPs as to the fact that something's going on out there. People ought to start paying attention. So here's the outpost number 2. He's maybe a guy over on high ground. Excuse me. My pen didn't work so well. And he in turn gets a bearing like that. So with those 2 coordinates, they are able back here at the command post to determine the exact location of that flash of that gun. Now, oftentimes it isn't a flash of a gun. It might be into something more obvious like a troop convoy. Anything that's of military interest, they want to know back at the command post. The third OP, who out here maybe is in a high building, if he comes back with a bearing and it goes something like that, you know that he's probably not looking at the same incident. If he gets a good fix there, a good intersection, you know that you've got a proper location. So this is flash ranging in a nutshell. There isn't much to it except courageous and alert outposts. We're going to feed back the information back here. Now we'll go over to the stuff that was a little bit more complex. I passed out before the meeting little sheets, 8.5 by 11 sheets, and gave you a little visual representation of what happens when a gun goes off. And this sound wave is sent by a sound base. Normally, some of the other poor devils, I didn't mind exposing themselves to heavy fire, had to go out and survey in these particular spots. It should be in a very precise line. Now what these are here are microphones that are buried in the ground, and they are nothing more than a device that's about the size of a large thermostat. And then the top of it, it's got a fixed plate and a very thin membrane plate. And there is about 90 volts of voltage goes through the lines, the electrical lines, that connect these things all up. Now, this sounds kind of high-tech stuff, but really, by today's standards, it's very elemental. But anyhow, what happens when the gun goes off up here in this position? It takes a certain period of time for that sound wave to reach this microphone, to reach this one, and this one, and so on. You look at your little sheets, you'll see that for each position on that sheet, you have a different time interval. Now, through a little bit of elemental high school geometry, you could take those time lapses between the time the pressure wave reaches these microphones, and you can extrapolate that down to a compass bearing. And so you just take these information, read the film, which is those little wiggles, and you could come up with a plot and a bearing. Now, I think a lot of you, I think a lot of you will realize that this sounds like an idealistic situation. There are a lot of things that can go wrong and always do. That's almost an axiom in the military. If it can go wrong, it will go wrong. First place, flash was much more reliable because you're pretty sure that everybody's looking at the same thing. In sound, it's a much iffier situation because in certain instances, there isn't one gun going off, there's 20 guns going off. And you might as well throw that little film strip away because it's just a mass of wiggles. So it takes time and talent to learn to be able to interpret a physical tape to show those time intervals. Over here on my little demonstration, I have a picture of what they call an oscillograph. This was nothing more than a machine which took the electrical feedback from the microphone And whenever the pressure wave hit the microphone, there's a little wiggle in the line, okay? So, as we found out in later months, it wasn't always that simple. What sounded good in practice was not so reliable in fact. Some of you maybe remember your physics. I had to look it up myself in order to get these figures. But anyhow, speed travels sound travels pretty fast. It actually it actually travels at about 770 miles per hour, or about 1,130 feet per second. Okay, to translate that back, this is what they call a 4-second sound base. In other words, the distance between here and here is the time it takes sound to travel in 4 seconds. And to further button that down, that is about 0.8 of a mile. So you can realize that the survey boys had their hands full, particularly if the front was very active, going out there and surveying these microphones in, and also laying the wire that had to connect them back to the command post. So we went through this basic training on the elements of sound ranging, and finally they felt that we were, the unit was sufficiently trained to go into actual operation. And so we were loaded aboard train and took a train up to Miles Standish, which is a debarkation point for overseas. Some of the guys didn't know when we left Camp Gordon whether we were going to the Pacific or whether we were going to go to ETO. But some smart guy figures out, well, it's early in the morning and the sun's shining into the train from your right-hand shoulder that we're headed north. And we were. When we got to Standish, it was the typical military base. I know a lot of you fellows in here look like you're Army veterans. You know that if you go to the PX or go to the theater, you better memorize the building number because we're all painted alike and they're all regimented up in rows. And if you don't memorize the building number, you might not find your bunk for that night. But in any event, we were only there a few days, not permitted any leave, because, you know, they always say a loose lip sinks a ship. And so we were finally loaded up on a ship down at the docks in Boston, and we were fortunate to have as our carrier into the EDO the USS Wakefield. Now the Wakefield had been formerly a luxury liner, but they had stripped out all the amenities from this and converted it to a troop carrier. Well, this ship is, I have a picture over here of it for you, which I got off the internet. But anyhow, this ship is 705 feet long, about 86 feet wide, about 31-foot draft. That's a pretty good sized ship. But yet, on the other hand, when you think that they loaded 6,000 troops on that ship, and plus a crew of about 800. So quarters are pretty cramped. When we came aboard and went down below decks, we found out that somebody had really used the space very carefully. Bunks on the troop ship were 5 high, 18 inches apart, up to about 7 feet. And they don't even waste the space of what a mattress would take. They were lace canvas on a pipe frame. So we were off to the ETO, and we were fortunate that we didn't even have to go in convoy because that ship was considered fast enough to be able to outrun any German subs. Okay, well, and we were quickly to learn there's only about 4 things that you can do when you're on a troop ship. You can eat, you can sleep, you can gaze at the ocean, or you can gamble. Now the guys that chose to to sleep. They found out that was a hazardous situation because with those narrow bunks, the guy who was in the top bunk could invariably step on your hand or your face getting up to the top bunk. As far as eating is concerned, feeding 6,000 men twice a day was a very large job. Actually, breakfast started at 5 a.m., went to 11. There was a 3-hour break to clean up. Dinner started at 2 o'clock and went till 8. We'll do a little bit of arithmetic. You can see, all right, there's a 6-hour period. There's 60 minutes in an hour and 60 seconds in a minute. That turns out to be about 21,000 seconds, or you have to serve a man every 4 seconds. So a lot of your time was actually spent just doing nothing more than shuffling in a line which wound around through the ship. As far as the gambling is concerned, we had a bunch of guys in our outfit who were streetwise kids, and they knew you don't draw to the inside of a straight. They knew that 3 or 4 was not a very good point to make a dice. So they really took some of these younger guys really to the clean. To just back up for a moment, I wanted to tell you more about the real heterogeneous mix we had in this outfit. I don't know who dreamed up who went where, but our battery of 150 men were from 31 different states. We had a Japanese boy from Hawaii, had a rancher's son from Idaho. We had a bunch of boys from the mountains of West Virginia. We had streetwise kids from the Bronx. I never saw such a diversified group of men. This may have been largely because the outfit was formed late in the war. Are we better off with or without the mic?
Without.
With.
Without.
Without. Okay. All right. All right. As long as my voice is strong enough to carry back there, it'll be fine with me. Well, we landed in Liverpool, England on the 19th of October, and almost immediately we entrained, within a matter of hours, we were on a train going to Southampton, which is a relatively short trip across the southern tip of England. And as is typical for England, it rained almost constantly all the time that we were there. When we arrived in Southampton, they put us into pyramidal tents, and we had no place to put our gear, so everybody dumped their gear on the floor. We weren't there more than about a single day when we were loaded out down to the docks. And what really amazed me is this is October of 1944, October. And the British public had seen literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men to go to the docks to be transported across into Europe. We were surprised. It was a driving rainstorm, and here we were at around 8 o'clock in the morning, quick stepping down the cobblestone streets to the docks, and here were these English people out there waving and cheering and passing out warm beer, all kinds of fruit, all this kind of thing. And I thought to myself, this is really heartwarming that these people should be out there this many months after, and it had to be such a common sight. But in any event, we loaded into a very small ship. I think it was English, but there were hammocks, and again, they would sling those so that they were cheered. We had no place to put our gear. About all we were carrying is the conventional OD uniform and a field jacket. We had a pack, a light pack, which is actually what they call the musette bag. I think some of you remember the musette bag. Your musette bag with your essentials in there, your cartridge belt, canteen, and of course your rifle. So we disposed this on a jumble on the floor of the ship. And we took the 100-mile trip from Southampton to Omaha Beach. Now, we weren't we're lucky. We were there, that's D plus 120 some days, so that we were in no danger. But we found out it was still a hazardous occupation because when we got over to close to the Omaha Beach, and they brought us up out of the hold, they had these rope ladders that hung down over the side of the ship, and these LCIs which were in the water down below. Well, the English Channel is notoriously rough, and the ship would pitch and roll, and the LCI would pitch and roll, and it was really a frightening experience to crawl down that rope ladder and into the LCI. So an LCI is just merely a vehicle for getting you from the ship through the shallow water to the beach. And when you're going in to the beach, you can't see anything because you're packed in there shoulder to shoulder. I don't think a guy could have even fallen down because we were packed in that close, and the gunwale is that high, it's over your head, so you can't see anything. But when you hit the beach and the front end dropped down, we still had to walk in water, maybe to our knees, up on the sand beach. Omaha Beach certainly didn't look anything like it did on D-Day or D plus 2 or 3. They had cleaned up the beach considerably. There was about the only thing that you could see there was, I remember seeing a single tank in the water, buried about halfway. It evidently hadn't made it to the beach. Along these steel beam tank barriers, which they put in the water. The other thing that was visible was the cliffs that overhung the beach. There were a number of places in there where large sections of that had been blown open in order to put roads up onto the flats up above. And what really, I guess, shook us up more than anything else, even though we knew we were in no danger, is when we walked up to the top of the road and got into the flats, and there was this enormous cemetery. There's a picture of it there, a very small picture. But they had buried some several thousand of the fatalities on Omaha Beach in this cemetery. It's no longer there. It was moved to a more permanent cemetery, I believe, in Holland. But in any event, in a short time, they hiked us down the road to a little place called Ballone, and they decided that we would camp out on the field. Well, in our hurry to get through England, our battalion commander, Colonel Spinks, was so eager to get our outfit into combat that we had outrun our equipment. And we found out that when we hit France, we had no field equipment at all. No vehicles, no operational equipment, no field kitchen, no nothing. So what to do with this? Well, the best thing to do was to put us in this field between the hedgerows of France, and everybody had on their a horseshoe roll over their musette bag. And in your horseshoe roll, you had a couple blankets. Well, 4 men would get together and pitch their pup tents for a weatherproof shelter. Are you all familiar with what I term a pup tent?
Yeah.
Well, actually, they're better for dogs than they are for people. But there's a picture of them over here. But actually, they haven't changed materially since the days of the Civil War. There was a pup tent in the Civil War. But in any event, we pitched our tents and tried to make the most livable situation we could out of it. But as the days wore on, the quartermaster was not able to bring us our equipment, so they didn't know what to do with us because without equipment we were operationally nothing. And so, as time went by, it got more and more difficult to live in these little pup tents. 4 men in a space which would be about 5 by 14 feet is about what it would be. You have no headroom at all in a pup tent. So some of the, GIs are very good at improvising when the situation requires it. So a bunch of the GIs decided, well, we're going to raise the size of these pup tents. So they went down the road somewhere and they scrounged some timber.
And they brought it back and they built a knee wall about that high off the ground around their pup tent. Well, everybody saw that. That's a great idea. So pretty soon the countryside was full of GIs looking for lumber. Well, among other things, one French farmer claimed that his cattle shed completely disappeared. And the Army Quartermaster Corps was very put out because they tore the flooring out of a flat car and used that. But as the days wore on and our outfit didn't have a field kitchen, all they had to prepare meals with were 4 of these large GI cans. You had one for coffee, one for stew, one for dishwater, and one to rinse. That's all we had. So in a short order, we were getting literally desperate for a decent meal to eat. And so, as I say, GIs are very enterprising, particularly when they've got a lot of time on their hands. And they discovered that there was a widow, French widow, down the road about a half a mile, who was more than happy to serve steak dinners with Calvados, which is a very powerful apple brandy, serve steak dinners at a decent price. Well, she did a tremendous business, as you can imagine. And she did even better business when some of the more enterprising or venturesome fellows discovered that the widow's daughter served dessert. At a price not too much more than the steak dinner.
This conniving
But there's certain things you have to learn about new cultures. For instance, I don't think a lot of people really understood the culture of France, because one of the first things we had to have in this Camp C-42, is what it's called, is you have to have a latrine. And so, we just go down to the edge of the hedgerow, and we dig a trench and hang a suspended pole over it. Well, after the first few mornings, it wasn't an uncommon sight to see a half a dozen guys sitting down at the latrine with their bare bottoms hanging over the pole. Well, we also found out that that was the direct route of this other farmer down the road. He and his wife went by there to till the field. Bonjour, soda. Well, most of these soldiers were really embarrassed. And so the Frenchman, he couldn't understand it at all when we erected a canvas barricade so that they could see this. As I say, food became almost a mania with everyone. And a couple of us were sitting in the tent one day there, didn't have too much to do. And one of my tent mates came in, he says, "Hey, look what I found." And under his field jacket, he had 2 tins of Spam. They were about that long and about that square, probably about 5-pound tins. And we thought, oh boy, this is great. But 2 tins of Spam is not going to feed 150 men. So we decided we'll keep this a secret. And it wasn't very palatable and cold at all. We were only permitted 1 fire. For a couple of reasons. Number 1, firewood was scarce, and number 2, it isn't exactly in the world to have half a dozen fires or maybe 20 fires burning at night. So we had 1 authorized fire in the center part of the camp. And so we decided, well, we'll cut up this Spam and we'll put it in our canteen cup, you know what those were? And we'll go down to the fire and we'll warm the canteen cup in the fire. Well, as soon as we got the canteen cup near the fire, it started to sizzle. So we decided, well, maybe we better sing to cover up the sizzle. But you can't cover up the aroma. And before long, they discovered our 10 pounds of Spam, and in a twinkling, the whole 10 pounds was gone. Well, finally, on about the 29th of May, we were given a break. We packed up our tents and we moved into Cherbourg, which is a seaport right on the outer end of the Cherbourg Peninsula. It was still bombed and still out of commission, but nonetheless, there were tremendous quantities of supplies going into going to the battlefront through the port of Cherbourg. But naturally, they couldn't let us just laze around all day. They had to give us a job. And the job that they had devised for us was to be train guards on supply trains moving from Cherbourg to a little town called Lyon. Now, I'm going to be a little careful about this because I think some people are under the impression that when a man takes the Pledge of Allegiance to the country and goes into the service, he automatically becomes a straight shooter, Boy Scout, and he would never be guilty of any crime. But I found out that this was not the case. As a sergeant, I had 4 privates to help me guard the train. We had to be in a 40 and 8 at the very rear of the train, of the supply train. And whenever the train stopped, it was my duty to send 2 privates up either side of the train to make sure that nobody tampered with the boxcars. Well, the signal was that when they were ready to go, it's 2 toots on the whistle, and my gosh, they had to really scramble to get back to the boxcar at the back end of the train so they wouldn't get left. But I very quickly found out that this train crew were not of the particularly highest type, and they deliberately were trying to lose the guards. And they were very successful at it because they would sometimes give insufficient notice, give us enough time to get back, to load on the rear end of the train. And in one other instance, the brakeman told me that this car had a hot journal box that it had to be switched off to the side. Well, naturally, I had to leave a man to guard it. But on several occasions when I had that duty on guarding train, we would have, the last thing we had to do was to check the seals on the box cars before we turned it over to the next crew. And invariably, the seals on the box cars were broken within the first 2 cars behind the engine. Well, this pretty much clearly implicated the crew. And I found out, and I'll tell you something about it later, I found out that there were all too many men, well, I won't say that, there were a few men in the service who saw this as an opportunity to make money, and they did. So finally, after our train guard service was over, we were gradually starting to work our way north. This was probably early December, worked our way north towards the battlefront, which was probably still a couple of 100 kilometers, or maybe 150 miles away. And we were at a little place called Arguil, and it was a chateau there. I remember very well, we were there on the 16th of December. And the 16th of December sticks in many people's minds because it was the date of the massacre of Malmedy. Now, any of you that have not heard about that, that was a case where members of the B Battery of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion were caught unawares, and they were herded into a field, and 86 of them were machine gunned to death. Now, I have a little report up in here, which a few of you might want to take. It's an 8-page report on what happened at Malmedy. And there are a number of different speculations about it. One was that it was just pure viciousness on the part of the Nazis to machine gun those men. Another theory is that some men had tried to escape, and under the Geneva Convention, they're entitled to shoot at men trying to escape. And thirdly, there's even a more far-fetched theory that some of the men grabbed up weapons and started to do battle with the Germans. The truth of the matter is, despite this report, no one really knows exactly what happened at Malmedy, except that in any way you could cut it, 86 men were dead. That scared the liver out of my folks because the papers back home said B battery of an observation battalion had been killed at Malmedy, and I was in a B battery, but not that one, fortunately. And we didn't, even though we were within probably 60 miles of Malmedy, we did not know that even occurred until much later. Of course, a lot of people do not know that at Malmedy, it happened on the 16th of December, and that ground was controlled by the Germans. It wasn't actually until a couple of weeks into January that they discovered and were able to retrieve many of those bodies. So it was close to Christmas, and I don't know what got into some of us, but we thought maybe it might be appropriate to go to church. It was a small Catholic church there close by, and so we went down to evening mass, and when we got to the front of the church, we were all carrying our rifles. We didn't know what to do, you know. Frankly, you don't have to carry a rifle in a church, but on the other hand, you're taught in the Army that your rifle's your baby, you better take care of it. So a bunch of us crowded into this Catholic church on this one pre-Christmas service, and I'm sure the French people were quite baffled by the sight of this many soldiers carrying rifles into a church of God. Well, shortly after the first of the year, just up north of a town called Aachen, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, we set up our first of our sound base, and this is where reality set in. We found out it wasn't just the good, easy textbook thing that they had told us about back in Camp Gordon. Naturally, these guys had to go out under fire and lay out this wire, survey in these microphones, and I really did feel sorry for the guys who were the OPs, because actually this distance here is about a mile. The requirements of the system mean that this guy has got to be 2 sound seconds at least ahead of this. Well, 2 sound seconds is about half a mile. So this is far enough ahead at the front, and this guy is really out there. And I don't know, I feel a little cynical about the Army at times, but actually our OP, of all people, they chose one of the few guys that had a wife and 2 children. But anyhow, we set up we set up a sound base at a place called Lammersdorf under the tutelage of what they call the 8th Observation Battalion. Normally, that was the way that they would do it. They would put green troops in there with people who've been around for a while and teach them what to do and more what not to do. But actually, the record shows, and this isn't my good memory, I have a little booklet up in here. Somebody wrote it up there shortly after the war. We actually had located about 84 targets. I'm talking about the sound division. And we were there, and for whatever reason, I've never quite understood, but suddenly we were yanked out of the lines, and we were sent north to Holland, of all places. And we actually were put under the direction of Sir Bernard Montgomery, the British Army in Holland. So Holland is an ideal place for something like sound ranging because it's flat as a pool table, and it just suited that sort of operation completely. But the other thing, the thing about it was that there was absolutely nothing going on up there. Now, this was about mid-January, because at this time the Allies had repulsed the Battle of the Bulge, and they were gradually pushing the Germans back. From about mid-December was the attack by the Germans, and they held considerable territory until after the first of the year. But we had nothing going on up there, and I don't even know why they sent us there. But one afternoon, I was the ranking NCO, and we had this little command post, and we were sitting in there doing not much of anything except smoking and shooting a bull. And lo and behold, out of nowhere comes this British officer, and he has his little coterie of officers along with him. He's complete with his swagger stick and the whole 9-yard stuff. And he comes in and he says, "I say there, boy," he said, "how's it going?" And I told him, "Oh, it was pretty quiet, there wasn't much doing." And he said, "Well, I'm from the British artillery unit over here, and we badly need something to shoot at. Can't you give me some targets?" And I said, "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know his rank at all because I couldn't read British insignia. But anyhow, I told him, 'No, I'm sorry, sir. There's absolutely nothing going on.' But he evidently knew what a sound observation unit was all about, because he went over and he started rummaging around in a cardboard box. He pulled out some of these films, like I'm showing you there. And he says, 'Oh, here.' He says, you have some dandy plots here." And I said to him, "Well, sir, those are test plots. You know, the peculiar thing about sound ranging is that if you have a gun that's up here, you get the pattern on the film. There's actually a gun right down here in this point will give you exactly the same pattern. In other words, you could very easily be fooled into giving a false set of coordinates. Well, that's what he wanted me to do, was give him coordinates from something with really hard guns. So actually, after 10 or 15 minutes, and he saw I wasn't going to give him anything that would have been any use to him, he went away muttering something about damnable yank and insubordination. I think he might have even said courts-martial, but anyhow, nothing ever happened of it. Well, as time wore on here, you know, the Battle of Bulge was the last gasp, really, of the German military. Once they had not succeeded in poking through the lines, they were in full retreat. And over a period of time, they were gradually forced back to the Rhine River. And east of the Rhine was sacred land. That was the fatherland. And Hitler was determined that we were not going to proceed into the fatherland. The map that I have over here in the corner actually is an extremely detailed map of that area in what they call Wessel. And we had a very productive sound base there on the Rhine River, because the front lines were static for a long period of time. When I say long period, I mean about 6 or 7 days, as the Allies gradually moved up armor and troops to the west bank of the Rhine River. Most of you, I think, looked at Ken Burns' The War, and I was kind of surprised that he gave such little exposure to the crossing of the Rhine. Now, I grant you that actually at that time, the Germans were pretty well a beaten army. But nonetheless, the Allies had amassed a tremendous force on the west bank of the Rhine. When I mean force of guns, paratroops, troops of all kinds. And on the crossing of the Rhine, I remember very well that one evening, which would have been, I'm not sure exactly, somewhere in about the middle of March sometime, when there were simultaneous attacks across the Rhine River and into Germany. There was about 1,800 guns started at about 6 o'clock in the evening and fired constantly. They weren't firing at targets. They were just saturation artillery explosions. 1,800 guns going off. You couldn't even hear an explosion. It generated into nothing more than a roar of noise. And so they really saturated the east bank of the Rhine with artillery fire. Early in the morning, probably 6, maybe 7 o'clock in the morning, then planes started coming over, and we saw the airdrop of the paratroopers at Wessel. Again, I think it was actually more than was necessary because the Germans were pretty well beaten, but you know, the Army has a thing about if they have paratroopers, they're going to use them, and they used them to effect on that day. Within short order after crossing the Rhine, they encircled what is known as the Ruhr Pocket, and this is a very industrialized part of Germany, some of the heavy industry of Germany, and they bagged something on the order of 250,000 to 300,000 German troops in the Ruhr Pocket. Well, actually, at that point in time, it was a cakewalk. Everybody was punching into Germany just about as fast as the trucks could roll. And we were along with the rest, and we traveled on the Reichs Autobahn, which is a super highway. Hitler's version of the Pennsylvania Turnpike. But anyhow, it's two lanes this way, 2 lanes west, medial strip in the middle. And by this time, the Allies were traveling east on both lanes, going east, and the medial strip were literally hundreds of thousands of German troops that were marching to the west to give themselves up. Now, this was probably a week or so before the very end of the war. But as we moved further into Germany, we no longer had to break out the pup tents when it came night to find a place to sleep. This was touched on in Stephen Ambrose's book, The Band of Brothers. A lot of you, I'm sure, read that. But anyhow, it was customary when you were in areas and you needed troop billeting for the night, the officer would go up and down the street, he'd knock on doors, and he'd say, 5 minutes, out. And so the people had to immediately vacate the house, move in with neighbors across the street, and the troops would be billeted in the house. Actually, I had a very unusual feeling going into a house like that. Before this, we'd always been in bombed-out shell or pup tents or something else. But you really honestly felt like you were violating the sanctity of somebody's good home. Again, they touch on this in Band of Brothers. The fact is, mostly the troops identified socially with the Germans. In other words, their homes were like our homes. You went into a home in Germany that had central heating, had an indoor bathroom, it had a kitchen, it had all the amenities of home. Everything was clean, it was neat. And of course, I'm afraid, again, that a lot of soldiers, all too many, did not observe the sanctity of those homes. And there was a wide amount of looting that went on. And things that should not have been taken. I figured something like a Nazi flag was probably fair game. I actually got a flag out of a home. It wasn't hanging out in the front porch, it was upstairs bureau. But more people than enough actually looted things. But anyhow, we stopped in this one town called Hanover, Hannover. We stopped for the night there and went to the usual knock on the door. People go across the street. Well, for whatever reason that night, I don't know, because I'm not usually the last guy in the chow line. But we had our mobile kitchen, an Army 6x6, and when the evening meal came, you'd get your mess kit, you'd go down on the street, the guys had been preparing the meal, and you would gradually go up this line and get your chow. As I say, for whatever reason, I don't know, but I was the last guy in the line. And I was inching my way along, and suddenly there appears an elderly German woman, very, very well dressed, but she was furious. And she edged up to me and she started to speak to me in a torrent of German, of which I understood nothing. But I figured, I don't know why she chose me. It's either because I look young and impressionable, or because she might have seen me come out of her house. But in any event, as I edged along the chow line, she matched me step for step, and she had a heavy cane. And she'd be going like this with the cane, you know, perilously close to my feet. But her voice literally rose to a scream. And I know it was frustration and anger at being evicted from her house. Some of the other soldiers that were standing nearby laughed about it, but somehow I could not. So we're winding down the war. We ended up in a little town called Fulda, which was probably a stone's throw from the Elbe River. Some of you who may not be World War II buffs will not realize that the Elbe River was the line of demarcation between the Americans and the Russians. We were to move no further east than the Elbe River. They were to move no further west than the Elbe River. This would preclude us accidentally shooting each other. But now I wanted to tell you one little story. About something that happened up on the Elbe River. This happened to be the one the story that I'm telling now is the one that I told the WWII. And it's not a story about valor or heroics or blood and gore or any of that. It's just a story about people. But I got myself into a real deep pickle because of poor judgment. I had a friend by the name of Ed Bierman. Ed Bierman was Jewish, and he spoke Yiddish very fluently. A lot of people don't know that Yiddish is pretty close to German. If you could speak Yiddish, you could get along pretty well in Germany. But anyhow, Ed was up on the Elbe River, and for days, or practically a week, German soldiers had been bypassing us, going to the west by the thousands. And no guards on them, they were just giving up. The war was over for them. And they were being impounded in stockades, which are nothing more than a single strand of barbed wire. And there were tens of thousands of these guys in these stockades, so-called, until it got to a point where the army could no longer feed them or protect them. So they said, enough. We've got to shut off the flow of Germans coming to the west. So I think that the Army generals are aware of the fact that when you shut off that flow of German prisoners, you're relegating them to the Russians. And believe me, the Russians were not somebody you wanted to surrender to. But in any event, Ed was up on the river, and he just happened by a stroke of luck to be there when the last few stragglers were coming across. And an officer stepped out of the boat, and he handed him a bag of souvenirs. Every soldier wants a souvenir, you know. They want a pistol or a Nazi flag or something or other. But Ed was just congratulating himself on getting this bag of souvenirs when up pulls an officer in a Jeep and commandeers the bag from him. Didn't even, I guess you know, just pulled his rank and took the bag. Of course, Ed was absolutely furious. And he came back and, well, you have to know Ed to really know the real story here. But Ed was one of these free spirits. He was one of these guys that was a corporal in the Army. He never would have risen any further if he'd been there for 100 years because he had little or no respect for anything military. But anyhow, after his anger cooled down, he decided that maybe we ought to go back and try again. And he talked me into going up to the river with him and looking to see if we could get some more souvenirs. Well, when we got back up to the river, it was deserted. You could see across the river, which was about 100 yards wide, and you could see for a mile or so beyond the river, see nothing, virtually hardly any buildings even at that place. So I'm walking along the shore there, and Ed's poking down around the bank, and suddenly he discovers an inflatable boat, a good-sized inflatable boat, something that could be paddled only by maybe a dozen men or something like that. And here he is trying to struggle to get this boat in the... I said, Ed, what in the hell are you trying to do? He said, we're going over to the other side and look for souvenirs. Well, at that point in time, I blamed myself. I should have foreseen what was going to happen, but the Army instills in you the fact that you support your buddy. You go along with them. Sometimes it's not your own betterment, but you do so anyhow. Anyhow, there I was down there helping to push the boat in the river. And we got into this thing, and we very quickly found out that it was pretty hard to paddle. We were drifting down the river. And around the bend of the river comes a big, enormous patrol boat with American flags snapping off the bow and stern, you know. He comes up within hailing distance of us. He sticks a big bullhorn out the cabin window. He says, well, what the hell are you guys trying to do? Get your panties back to the other side. Well, that isn't what he said. I can't tell you. But at any rate, he no sooner gave us our instructions than he turned around and went around the curve and out of sight. Well, you know, Ed had to have his way. No, we weren't going back. We were going across. So we did paddle over, and we only lost maybe a quarter or half a mile down the river. We tied up the boat and took off to see if we could find some souvenirs. We ran into a very few stragglers, not more than a half a dozen. These guys were not even armed, but they were obviously German soldiers. And then suddenly, I don't know, it almost seemed to strike both of us simultaneously. Hey, people better guard that boat. So we pell-mell went back to the shore where we knew we had tied up the boat, and the boat was gone. Well, you're faced with a real dilemma. We knew that we could always hail the patrol, but would it mean what? Reprimand? Court-martial? I don't know. Well, fortunately, we didn't have to find out, because just about the time we were ready to give it up, out from the other shore comes another boat of GIs, American GIs, about 5 or 6 of them. Well, believe me, when they hit the shore, we were right there. We were right there. But I couldn't believe what happened then. These guys all want to dash off with a souvenir, and Ed's going to go with them. I said, look, you're certainly not going to leave that boat unattended. I said, I'll stay. So I did, and in short order, the guys were out of sight and bounced down. And I sat down on the edge of the boat and lit a cigarette, put my carbine across my knees, and within about maybe 10 minutes, I heard a rustle in the bushes, and a German soldier sticks his head out of the bushes. And he was obviously chagrined to see me there, and I can't give you a good description of the man now after 60 years. But anyhow, he seemed to be an amiable sort, if I can use the word. But we couldn't converse, but obviously he wanted transportation over to the other side of the river. And I went through a bunch of gyrations, you know, putting up fingers on more GIs, you know, around, they'd gone off. Evidently, through sign language or whatever, we managed to make ourselves understood. So I sat there for a while. I'm getting a little nervous because these guys had been gone a while. And pretty quick, 2 more showed up. It was an old man and a boy. And they had a conversation in German, which again I can't understand. And it appeared that they'd agreed that this would be agreeable to wait until the other guys come back and we would get it all go up all across the river. Well, cutting the shorter down, before the guys got back, there was a fourth guy turned up. And he looked like a hard case to me, and he really had me concerned. And I got to thinking, you know, gee, 4-1 here. I'm sitting here with my carbine, and I don't even know whether I have a loaded clip in my rifle. And I didn't think it was a very good idea to check. It occurred to me that probably what dissuaded them from jumping me was that patrol boat was going up and down about every quarter hour. It went up and down. And they probably, it took a long enough time to paddle the river, they probably would have been caught out in the middle. They figured their chances were better if they were with GIs than if they were by themselves. But in any event, they didn't jump me. Shortly thereafter, when the souvenir hunters came back. And immediately there was a babble of voices, you know, mostly in German, Ed trying to do most of the talking. These 4 guys, one trip over to the West Shore. Well, frankly, I was the only one out of the group who thought we ought to take them. All the rest of them said, oh, we don't owe these SOBs anything, you know, let them rot, let them stay. So we got into the boat and paddled off, went over to the West Shore. But you know, it's after 60 years, I still can recall the look on the faces of these 3 men and a boy, as we paddled away from shore. Because they knew probably even better than I what they were in for. They were into being captured by the Russians. And to this day, I don't know whether those guys died, whether they went to Siberia, or what happened to them. But it always is hung in my memory as something that I should have done, but didn't do. So shortly thereafter, the war was over, within a couple of 3 days. And I understand that there were tremendous celebrations in New York, in Chicago, and places like that. Well, there wasn't much hoop-de-doo, you know, went on in the troops at the front for a couple of reasons. Number one, we probably had a better knowledge of what had happened than they had, and more secondarily, there was still the specter of the Pacific hanging over many of us, that we didn't know that the war wasn't over until Japan was defeated. So we didn't celebrate an awful lot, but we also were faced with a fairly long period of occupation. And that was quite a varied period of time. The first thing that I'm going to back up for a second here. As soon as the war was over in Europe, the Army devised something that's known as the Army Point System. Now, this was the system by which you determined when a man was eligible to go back to the States. And I don't remember the exact details, but there was 1 point for every month in the service. There was an additional point for every month overseas. There were 5 points for every battle star that you had. And there were also additional points for being married and having children and so forth. Additional points for having military citations. In any event, I knew I had 55 points, and there wasn't a chance in hell that I was going to go back to the States very quick. This was also discussed in some considerable detail in Ambrose's book, The Band of Brothers. So what to do with us during that period of time? During the summer, we were always in constant uncertainty about whether or not we were going to go to the Pacific, but once early August flew around and there was victory in Japan, then we knew that we were safe. But our service overseas had not terminated because we still had another 6 months of service. And I had one interesting assignment during that time. They started to break up the units, usually depending on how many points you had. They sent men all over everywhere. And who makes these decisions, I never knew. But certainly, you know that you're the guy that's going to be the result of the decisions. But anyhow, one of the places I got sent after the war was a U.S. Army internment camp number 76. And this was a very interesting place because it was an old castle dating clear back to the year 902 or something like that. And it had been used over the period of time for a prison. And after World War II, it was used as an internment camp. Now, it's not a POW camp. This was for people who had been German nationals who had been caught in the United States when the war was declared years before. Merchant seamen, merchant nationals of any kind that had been in the States when the time war was declared. They immediately put these people in prison. One of the guys that they had there was Fritz Kuhn. Anybody familiar with that name? He was the head of the German-American Bund. He was the head Nazi of the German party in the United States. Well, they latched on to him right away, and they put him in an internment camp in Texas. But when the war was over, they shipped him back to U.S. Army internment camp number 76. And he arrived with, I don't know, must have been 15 or 20 suitcases, all kinds of goodies and stuff that he had hoped to bring back to make his life better. And of course, they were stripped of all the personal belongings. He was put in a guardhouse, so to speak. But unfortunately, Fritz never got to see much of this stuff because somebody broke into the guardhouse. I was told that there were at least 6 or 7 cases, nothing more than shoes that he had. But anyhow, somebody pilfered all these shoes and they went to the black market. I know I'm going on here at length, but I just want to mention one other thing here. Is any of you veterans familiar with what they call the currency control book? Anybody hear of the currency control book? Well, this is an interesting thing. When the war was over, Berlin was broken up into sections: British, French, American, Russian. And each had a control of a certain part of the city. And of course, it was naturally a lot of intermingling of the troops there. And it was discovered, the Army Finance Office discovered that the amount of money that was being sent home through the Army Finance Office was 20 times the payroll. 20 times the payroll. Where is this money coming from? Well, obviously it was coming from the black market. Right. Men were sending home for anything of high intrinsic value in small space: cameras, watches, these sorts of things. Particularly cameras and watches. They would have them mailed to them over there in Berlin. They, in turn, would peddle these off to the Russians for their currency. And this currency, incidentally, was respected and exchanged by the American government. And they found out, of course, that this sort of a thing was going on a lot more places than just Berlin. It was going on all over France. But the interesting thing about the currency control book is the time came, finally, when you had to fess up on how much money you had. And when just before you were going to get on the boat, which we were going to get on the boat at Pearl Harbor, there were guys going through the camp. Anybody got room on their control book? Well, some of us were smart enough to hold out to the last minute. Some of them were offering 30%, some of them 10%. If most of the time they got the load on the boat, the more desperate they got. Some of these guys had tens of thousands of dollars in currency that they had to turn into the finance office. And they in turn to mark in your book so much money when you got on the boat. Then they would give you gold seal notes equivalent to what you turned in. Well, these guys couldn't explain that money, and And so they were trying to find people who had room on their control book. And you know, if you waited long enough, I got 50% on mine. It was foolproof. You didn't risk anything because the guy gave me the money. I put it into the finance office, and then when he got on the boat and I got on the boat, then I gave him his share. But the final, I thought at the time it was the final indignity. I no sooner got on the boat when this was an even larger boat incidentally. It had 10,000 troops on it. I was no sooner got on the boat than the captain says, "Warner, you're on KP." Oh, I said, "Captain," I said, what do you mean I'm on KP? You're not going to heap that indignity on a sergeant at this late date. He put his arm around my shoulder. He says, "You might not know it now, but I'm doing you a big favor." And he was. Because when we got on the boat, rather than being builded down in the bowels of the ship with these bunks, standing in line in terminal hours to get chow, we bunked with the crew. We got freshwater showers. We got 3 meals a day. But for all this luxury, there was a price to be paid. And we very quickly found out what it was. As I said, 10,000 troops on this ship. And one of the things they had is a mammoth supply of cold storage eggs. And when I first looked at that, they were figuring 10,000 men, 2.5 eggs per man, scrambled naturally. But we had to break, myself and 6 other sergeants, had to break 25,000 eggs every night. And my mother, poor soul, she couldn't quite understand why I could not stand aside of me. So I got over the floor and I had attended. As I say, my hearing isn't exactly what I would hope it to be. But if anybody, you've been a great audience. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Got any questions, officer? I'll relay any questions to the speaker. Yes, over here.
When they were, the sounds, when they were doing triangles, I guess you were using trigonometry?
It's really high school geometry is all it is. But you know, one of the things you have to observe about that, I've got a book up here. I've got the Army Field Manual on sound and flash operation sitting on the desk. This is dated 1964. So these kind of outfits existed for 20 years after the Army. But now they're completely out of date. Now one little orbital satellite up there with a high-powered camera makes all this stuff possible.
Anybody else? Yes, Jack.
The information which your unit found, did it go off to a Corps Fire Direction Center or to a division or what?
I'm not, as a matter of fact, you know, it's surprising how little you know sometimes about what goes on with what you do. We furnish these coordinates. In other words, when we got the intersection, we had coordinates. You know what an atlas looks like, you know, it got letters across the top, numbers down the side, and you could locate any spot by knowing the numbers and the letters. Well, coordinates were passed on to our battery headquarters, and they in turn, I would assume, fed that information to a gun outfit, usually 155s or 105s.
Did you get to go to Paris?
Go ahead.
Did you get to go to Paris?
Did you get to go to Paris, Dave?
Oh, yes.
What was it
Yeah, I
like?
did. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I even saw the Polish brochure. Yeah, and you know, that's really a high-tone show. I mean, the men came in tails, the women came in the wrong evening. This was probably about September of 1925. And it's certainly not like an East St. Louis burlesque house, I'll tell you that. It's really a high-class show. Yeah.
There it was.
Anybody else? I'll add one thing. Dave mentioned the ASTP program. Like probably a lot of you, I wondered what that was. Armed Services Training Program. And in 1994, when I was over in Europe with the Timberwolves, I ended up in a bar one night with one of them along about late 1942, early 43. Somebody in the Pentagon decided the war was going to go on for 10 years. And they felt that the rate they were killing infantry officers, that they were going to need to create an officer corps. So they pulled these guys with the high IQs and the high Army rating scores out and sent them to colleges. And by that, I'm talking about Princeton and Harvard and Penn and you name it, all across the United States. Well, along about the first part of 1944, they realized the war wasn't going to go on for 10 years. And they pulled all these guys out and put a lot of them in infantry outfits, like my dad's 104th Infantry Division Timberwolves, because they were training up the divisions that would replace the ones that got beat up on D-Day and shortly thereafter, that would go in early fall of 44 and replace them. And it was interesting. I was sitting in this bar in Bayeux, France, and this ex-officer told me about it. And then he introduced himself. It was ex-Governor Hugh Carey of the state of New York, who was one of the Timberwolves who had been in the ASTP program. And it was a rather interesting evening to get drunk with the ex-governor of New York.
One other quick thing here. I've got 4 or 5 copies of this detailed report on what happened at Normandy that you can have. If you want one, pick one up. If you have a computer, you can find it on a computer. There's a very detailed report in there. As a matter of fact, there's still questions 60 years after the fact as to what happened.
Okay, we're passing the helmet as usual. For those of you who are newcomers, we don't have dues. We pass the steel pot rather than the hat, and that helps us pay for the postage. Thank you very much, and I think there's a little chow left
It was a big mistake where we crossed the Rhine.